this discussion.
Kia ora, Zach. I'll just start by sharing this. Is this looking all right? Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think we are. Yep.
Cool. Oh, well, kia ora koutou. Thank you for coming along to today's session. I'd like to also extend a thanks to the conference organisers, particularly Michael and Zach, but also to the unnamed busy hands that run around in the background that make conferences like this possible. So thank you. My name's Pita King. I'm a senior lecturer with Massey University. My background is in community and Indigenous psychology, and also analytic philosophy. And it's my great pleasure today to act as chair / moderator for today's session entitled Reconsidering Qualitative Inquiry in Indigenous Communities, Insights from the Global South. So as you see, there's quite a number of us here. The discussants come from four, I guess, key areas, geographic areas, being Aotearoa, New Zealand, South America and Brazil, Indonesia, and Australia by way of South Africa. Now, rather than kind of refer to us as a group of sorts that's kind of got boundaries around it, we're part of more of what you'd probably call a series of interconnected relational networks that we work with each other in many ways through research, through supervision, through writing, but also, you know, meeting each other at conferences and supporting each other's work. So by no way is this an exhaustive list of the members of what we would refer to as colleagues within these networks, but these are the names of the people who heeded the call for today's session. And yeah, hopefully we can talk through some interesting ideas today in terms of what connects our areas of research in terms of our responses to our respective communities. So to provide a bit of an overview for today's roundtable, I've just got a series of ideas that was particularly outlined in our abstract, but that permeate throughout our work. So one of the ideas is that when working with Indigenous communities, we can often become preoccupied with epistemic issues and methods that can sometimes displace the primacy of culturally grounded relational processes of engagement that are so central within the communities that we work. And so a good example of this that you can see quite often is through the supervision dynamic, particularly when Indigenous scholars are supervising Indigenous students. They can often come with a lot of what they learned in undergrad in terms of their methodological and epistemological concerns. Not to say that they're not important, but when engaging with their own communities, sometimes Indigenous students themselves can end up prioritizing these epistemic and methodological issues that we're taught within the discipline when we actually know how to engage with our communities in ways that actually make sense. So there's often a tension there in terms of the primacy of the different sets of engagements or different ways of engaging, and reassuring students, but also ourselves, how it's actually okay to prioritize the ways that make sense to us in terms of engaging with participants. So we would argue that such relational processes are central in the production of actionable knowledge and the development of strategies for change that are sanctioned and led by communities. But in order to do this, we need to reconsider the role of qualitative inquiry within Indigenous community settings. So unlike conventional roundtables where each person presents their own piece of research individually, and then we try to make connections, what I thought we'd do within this roundtable is that through this relational network of collegial collaboration, we've had years of discussing and thinking about these ideas that we may not necessarily publish on or might find hard to articulate within the academic journals. But when we sit down as Indigenous peoples and allies, these conversations around how we engage through centralizing relational ethics and things like that, that makes so much sense in conversation, sometimes doesn't quite make it into the academic discourse within the journals. So we thought that we would try and centralize these commonalities within our collective work. And then I guess basically make these conversations more public and speak to a broader audience around these conversations that have been happening in and amongst our networks for some time now. So to bring focus for these discussions, we posed 3 questions. Number 1, what is the relationship between qualitative inquiry and knowledge production in Indigenous community settings? 2, what is the role of relational ethics in shaping qualitative inquiry in Indigenous settings and beyond? And 3rd, do we really need methods in the way that the term is understood within many mainstream systems of knowledge production? So to kick off, what I thought we'd do is, apologies, there's no video. We did record one, but there was a bit of a technical mishap. But what we thought we'd do is we'd take a couple of minutes each in terms of the discussants, just to introduce ourselves quickly, to talk a bit about our area of research, and then to speak to one of these questions. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. Hoping we can keep it within the half hour or so, and then open it up to the broader audience in terms of questions, or even if you want to answer these questions too and just play with some ideas, but keeping things more sort of conversational than kind of awkward and one at a time. So by all means, jump in whenever. So to begin, I would like to hand over to Mohi. Kia ora, Mohi.
Kia ora, Pita, and kia ora to everybody in all your different time zones, and appreciate the opportunity to have a chat today. I'm at the University of Waikato, and a lot of my work is related to Indigenous Māori health, poverty, homelessness, and a few other areas around the social determinants of health for Māori in particular. That's just real quick rundown. I'm just going to quickly respond to, I think, Pita, you wanted me to respond to one of the questions, or maybe a couple of the questions. I'll just quickly respond to, I guess, the first question, the relationship between qualitative inquiry and knowledge production in Indigenous community settings. I think what's really important from my perspective, coming from a very Māori perspective within the academy, within research, as a community psychologist, what's incredibly important for me is that the practices of inquiry ensure that we focus on social justice and liberation from a Māori perspective, and that this perspective sits within our colonial history, that has political and social implications for us as a minority peoples and a colonized peoples. So that has to be at the get-go. And in this perspective, there are traditional Māori notions of self-determination that must be prevalent within these within knowledge production, and within the inquiry approach and settings. This self-determination is important to ensure that work that's done within our communities, with our communities, is done in ways that recognizes and acknowledges our traditional Māori cultural values and systems and knowledge. And we often position ourselves to challenge the dominant hegemony within research. So I'll just start with that. I don't want to take over. There's like 11 of us on this panel, so I'll just start with that, and then I'll hand it back to you, Pita, and I'm happy to talk on this and other things as well. But I'll hand it over.
Kia ora, Mohi. Chris Sonn. Kia ora, Chris.
Bit early in the lineup, Pita. Good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. Christopher Sonn, I'm at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to the ancestors, elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respect to all First Nations colleagues who have joined in this webinar. And thanks to Pita for inviting me to be part of this. And like Pita says, I've really appreciated the ongoing relationship I've had with colleagues across the ditch for many years now. I guess for me, I am a member of the African diaspora, and so my positionality is a little bit different in that I speak from a different place as a settler. It's the first time I've said that I'm a settler, but I guess a settler in a settler colonial context. Whenever I think about this question, I keep on thinking, oh my God, this is about psychology, because I'm trained in psychology and community psychology, and I've always had this really odd relationship with it partly because of psychology's investment in what Thomas Teo talks about as hyperscience, I think he calls it, and also when he calls for or talks about psychological humanities. My work has centered and focused mostly on the notion of, or ideas around displacement, whether through migration, and that connects in very much with my own story as a migrant who's moved and has lived and worked here. The work dovetails with trying to understand the forces that displaces people, in our case, with the apartheid system and so forth, but also what that displacement had meant for me and communities such as the one that I come from, but also what that means when you come to a new place where there's another racial formation and different sorts of racial projects that have organized people's lives. So part of this was to search for and figure out where are the tools in psychology that's going to help address some of these questions that ends up being personal, but they're also questions about the discipline, who the discipline's for, how the discipline reproduces knowledge, and what is the relationship between that discipline and knowledge production processes in relation to Indigenous people and all of the other groups of people who make up this community. So I've been having all sorts of conversations, and I've ended up often borrowing from liberation psychology or other political psychologies, whether it's Black feminist thinking, but I've also been very influenced by writing that have come out of New Zealand, whether it's Linda Tuai-Smith's work on decolonizing, but what that actually means in the Australian context with people, and Indigenous people have also written critically about standpoint, about epistemology, about power. And so how do you think and how do you engage dialogically with the knowledges that Indigenous communities have produced? Because we do so unquestioningly sometimes as we can import knowledge from elsewhere, and we just assume that it's all right and we can reproduce them. But we have a different type of relationship with Indigenous knowledge. So I'm at the interface of thinking about my relationship to that knowledge and also whiteness and back into the institution. And then for me, qualitative is part of a broader. Qualitative can't be reduced to just quantitative and qualitative. I think the question as Peter's posed it is a really important one because it shifts our focus a little bit. Anyway, so that's a quick ramble because Peter put me on the spot.
I think I'm going to be putting everyone on the spot because there's very little logic to who I pick on next. So in saying that, kia ora Shiloh.
Ngā mihi mahana kia koutou, ko au te uri o te arawa māngai nui ko Shiloh Groot the Ho. My name is Shiloh Groot and I am a descendant of Te Arawa Nation. And I'm a community psychologist here at the University of Auckland. Similar to Chris, I have a love-hate relationship with psychology, sometimes more hate than love. I'm in love with its potential and its possibilities, and I'm often disappointed by its realities. But if I go back to that love part, there's so much potential for movement. There's so much possibility within psychology that it's also an exciting space. I have no idea why I picked the third question because I don't really know how to answer it, but I decided to. Just to give you some context, my area of research is homelessness and precarity, Indigenous communities and well-being, and labour justice and sex work. So I like flexibility in my methodological approaches, and there's a lot of rigidity when it comes to methods in psychology, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And then part of my dissatisfaction with psychology is that rigidity and very little room for movement. Even within Indigenous research, we have a substantial body of research. We have a substantial history, a body of literature talking about specific multi-methodological approaches. And even these can be quite rigid. And there's a fear, I think, that sort of fear of turning the mirror back on ourselves and self-critiquing a lot of our methods. So we end up with a really rigid approach, or a very formulaic approach to Indigenous research in Aotearoa New Zealand at times. And I think we're at a bit of a crisis point where there's a shift that needs to happen, a critique that needs to happen in order to advance our methodologies, our methods. And in general, mainstream systems of knowledge production, I like flexibility. So being able to engage with different modes of thinking and inquiry is exciting to me. I'm a researcher by passion and profession. So having that, I like to be able to bring both worlds together or have a bricolage of approaches that you utilize. And because I was put on the spot and I have no idea what else I'm going to say, I'm going to end it there and pass it back to Pita.
Kia ora, Shiloh. Tycho, kia ora.
Thanks, Pita, and everyone. So thank you for this opportunity for speaking on quite an interesting area of, I guess, research practice. It's something that I'm coming into quite, I guess, a lot more engagement with. When I started off, I think, in psychology as someone who was quite reluctant to engage with things like methodologies, and a lot of it's for some of the reasons that you've already spoken about. But for context, so I'm also at the University of Auckland. I'm one of Shiloh's PhD students. She probably thinks I've been here way too long. I'm also co-supervised by Linda Nikora and Virginia Brown. And I sort of align myself with community and liberation psychology, although we don't really have a lot of that at Auckland University, unfortunately. So thankfully I was kind of rescued a bit later on and sort of found my place in the field, I guess you could say. And my work, I'm kind of interested more broadly in sort of questions of precarity and disposition, but more specifically, my PhD focuses on the lived experiences of trans and gender diverse people who have experienced homelessness at some point in their lifetime in Aotearoa. I guess I'll have a go at sort of digging into the second question you posed for us, which is what is the role of relational ethics? I think to start on that, for me, it kind of came as a natural thing during the process of actually slowly coming up with my research project, is that I knew for the sake of the university I could engage in more procedural or tick box ethics, but due to the sort of, I guess, multiple borderlands that I exist in as a person, and also that of the sort of gray areas of, I guess, social positionings that my participants did, I learned pretty quickly that, you know, the tick box activities of how to engage with the community simply weren't going to work, and it wasn't going to work for me personally in terms of what I was happy with doing with my community, but it also wouldn't work in terms of, I don't think I would have gotten the kind of level of engagement that I have gotten if I had done it in a more sort of, I guess, a tick box way in which the university probably wanted me to do it in. And for me, part of that recognition was that the way that we currently do, or the way that we are often trained to do ethics or ethical engagement, I kind of, through also the learnings of other people, came to recognize how that is also a marginalizing and colonizing practice in itself. And so for me, I had to figure out ways in which actually my research wasn't going to sort of be implicated in the harm that I'm actively trying to undo. So for me, it's about building up relationships with people in my own community where it doesn't feel like I'm just being extracted for knowledge. It doesn't sort of feel like I'm going in, maybe getting a little bit of work done and then gapping it and, you know, ticking off my PhD and then I'm going to leave them behind. For me, this is an ongoing process. And I think that's more one of the fundamental aspects of relational ethics for me, is it takes a lot of time to build up to. So I know in my own research work in my own PhD, it was about 2 years of actually getting my feet even more embedded in these communities before I even did the more, you know, the field work, data collection kind of thing. So yeah, I think for me, some of the principles that we've drawn in relational ethics, and hopefully someone can articulate those more clearly for the rest, for people who aren't so familiar. But for me, that really is where some of the more transformative potential lies with psychology. I think we do need to have a sort of drastic move in how we actually do the doing of research. And for me, I have a lot of hope in, you know, more people sort of engaging in that relational way. But yeah, I'll leave it there because I could rant on forever. So you can come back to me later.
Kia ora. I've just realized that people not familiar with New Zealand and the Indigenous language, Te Reo Māori, may not be familiar with the term kia ora, because I'll be saying it a lot. When people finish, I'll say kia ora. When someone's about to start, I'll say kia ora. It means hello, it means thank you, it means many things. So if you're trying to figure out what I'm saying, it's kia ora. So who is next on the list? Danilo, kia ora.
Kia ora, Pita. Thank you for organizing this meeting. I'm indigenous with Machacali ancestry in Brazil. I'm a professor in the University of São Paulo. So I'm working with the Indigenous Support Network since 2011. We start a project with indigenous communities here. And from this work, we have been reflecting that research is a way of organizing our actions in time and space, and that is a rite for knowledge construction. And as a rite, a specific rite, academic rite, it interacts with other social rites from our communities. So for me, to make a qualitative inquiry is important in the sense of understanding how the academic rites interact with the community, other community rights. I don't know if I'm speaking correct English, but and then sometimes this interaction create challenges for us. So because we have other ways of knowledge construction and of other ways of legitimating knowledge, and these ways are not actually completely understood in the academic setting. So for us, the main challenge is how can we show and how can we interact with the research in the sense of changing the conceptions of what's knowledge, what's the relevant knowledge, what is to be focused in our knowledge construction. So the qualitative is the first and the main part of the research, because it allows us to talk about how to relate with the others in the sense of how to create an ethical understanding of this relationship and the implications of the relationship. And then for me, we need methods for doing this ethical approach. And this kind of method cannot be rigid in the sense of the mainstream way of knowledge construction. So yes, for starting, maybe I would say this, and then we discuss. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Danilo. Luciano, kia ora.
Kia ora, Pita. Hello, everyone. My name is Luciano. I'm a researcher at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. I work with Professor Danilo Guimarães at the Indigenous Support Network. And I'm going to share a bit of my experience during my postdoc research in order to address maybe the second question about the relational ethics. So in my research, I wanted to understand the meaning of the Guarani Mbuá expression, tecoporã. Tecoporã means, generally is translated as happiness, or more directly, a beautiful way of living, a beautiful life. And the Guarani Mbuá are indigenous people very present in Brazil and in South America. So in my method, I wanted to interview a few Guarani Mbuá leaders, which I thought would be a pretty straightforward thing. However, they would deny my invitations or say that they shouldn't talk about it. First, I tried to approach actually very, very important leaders, but they would deny it. And then I thought, well, let me go after Instagrammers and YouTubers. So this kind of leaders, very vocal Guarani Mbuá person, but they would say that they shouldn't talk about it. That tecoporã was such a sacred idea that only their elders were apt to do it. So, and also the Guarani Mbuá would say that they were tired of researchers going to their villages and after doing the research, leaving them without any real gain, any real transformation. Well, it took me 1.5 years for them to accept my invitations. And it was a very, very interesting process. I helped them with their projects and their necessities. I danced and chanted with them. And during this period, without being interviewed, the Guarani were telling me a lot about tecoporã. And it would be fundamental for analyzing the future interviews that I was going to make. In thinking in a general sense, I was basically entering the Guarani Mbuá world. Actually, I wasn't really entering, I was being invited to their world. And this, as I understand it, is ethics, sharing, respecting, and allowing the other to our place of doing. And because of that, because this relation, the relational ethics, what I first wrote as my method unfolded as something much richer, it became alive because of that process. So this is a bit of my postdoctorate research, and I'm really excited to be here in this forum discussing the subjects. So I'm handing the word back to you, Pita. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Luciano. Ahnya, kia ora, Ahnya.
Kia ora, everyone. Just move this slightly. So kia ora koutou, thank you all for coming along tonight. My name is Ahnya Martin. I'm a descendant from Waikato Tainui in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Also from England and Scotland on my mother's side. Graduate assistant and PhD student at Massey University. My current area of research is investigating the lived experiences of Māori whānau who are living in precarity, working on a low income. And in that, we're focusing on well-being. So my areas in this early stage are Indigenous and community psychologies. So I just wanted to speak to question 3. Do we really need methods in the way the term is understood within many mainstream systems of knowledge production? So in my experience of research at this early stage in my academic career, I have found traditional methodology can be quite hampering and confusing at times, especially as a Māori woman going to engage with Māori participants. So I felt throughout my undergraduate degree and even into postgraduate courses, the push towards mainstream methodologies made me really nervous and awkward, like that of engaging with others would be done in an artificial, sterile, tick box manner, one in which I was not used to. So therefore very uncomfortable with. So as I moved toward qualitative methods of engagement, specifically culturally patterned Māori ways of engaging with others through sharing whakapapa, our genealogy, whakapangangatanga, so establishing links and connections, and manakitanga, so really caring and respecting others. And also things that echoed within community psychology, so developing relationships and trust with others. I became more at ease and comfortable as I could see how these methods really were essential in paving the way for respectful engagement that wasn't artificial or sterile or tick box to me, as Pita kind of alluded to in the beginning, those foreign methods. So just briefly to, as I wrap up, an example I would like to share from my current engagements with participants is the importance of the values that underpin both Māori and community methods of engagement. So I've recently interviewed 10 households living in precarity 4 times each. So I go to their houses 4 times. I take food as a koha, which is known as a gift, to showcase my gratitude, my manaki, my respect. And one day one of the participants came to me and she said, this was on or around the 3rd interview, how the children were always really excited to see me. And I thought, oh, wow, that's awesome. I must really be doing well at this research thing. I've been able to leave that awkwardness of mainstream methodology that was haunting behind me. And she followed up by saying, yeah, you've now become known as the snack lady. And I thought, oh, wow, I'm the snack lady. The kids were so happy to see me because I bought the food, I bought the kai. So that really solidified to me that I don't need to worry about those notions that were kind of haunting of objectivity and experimenter bias and all of those things that are really pushed in undergrad, and that I can engage and connect with people as human, as Māori, and in my culturally patterned ways with others. And this is okay. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ahnya. Jony. Kia ora, Jony.
Kia ora, Pita. Hello, everyone. I'm Jony. I'm affiliated with Universitas Ciputra Surabaya in Indonesia, but I'm currently doing my PhD in Massey University. I'm going to discuss the first questions. What is the relationship between qualitative inquiry and knowledge production in Indigenous community settings? For me, doing qualitative inquiry to Indigenous community setting means embracing local relational concepts and practices as design features when engaging and analyzing participants' account. In other words, central here is re-articulation or of the general methods of knowledge production, such as interview, to be fit with the cultural milieu within which the methods are now used. Within the context of my research, which is looking at the everyday conduct of interethnic marriage in Indonesia, central is the immersion to the local community where the couple interact every day. I involve intensively to the community, build relationship, contribute to the community members, and this is including but not limited to using local language they use, such as like Javanese language have different linguistic styles that signals respect. So I use that as well, following their routines and learn from there. And in short, I re-articulate the methods to be relevant with cultural milieu within which participants conduct their marriage. And this means that the choice of the method is not for the sake of the method itself, but it is to enable us to centralize participants' life. And the point here is not disrupting participants' everyday activities, but rather let them do the activities and we learn from there. Many of my participants are working in informal sectors, being an onion seller, going to the market, traditional market regularly, cooking, running a small shop. And it is through following them doing their activities that I can explore the complexity of their marriages. And doing immersion with them actually enables me to get the ethos of these families through methods that are germane to the participants. That's from me. Thank you very much, Pita.
Kia ora, Jony. Nuke. Kia ora, Nuke.
Kia ora, Pita. Hi everyone. Kia ora everyone. Apa kabar? I'm Nuke. I'm an Indonesian scholar. I'm from Universitas Negeri Semarang, Central Java, but now I'm a PhD student in Messi University under supervised Professor Darrin and Pita. And so in my last 10 years works, I work with the vulnerable community, more specifically is with the vulnerable women. And now I think I will share my research is about the Muslim migrant women community in New Zealand as a part of my PhD work. It's about how they work together, how they support each other within community. So I will give a brief quickly for the second question about what is the role of relational ethics in shaping qualitative inquiry in Indigenous setting and beyond. So in my research, I'm working with Muslim migrant women coming from different ethnicities, and this is a bit challenging. Yes, we are coming from the same faith, but we have very different way of life in expression in everything. So I'm working with Afghani, South African, Sudanese, and then Fiji Indian, and Somali, Tanzanian, Thai, Samoan, and Russian. It's about 20 something. And then plus most of them, they are coming from vulnerable backgrounds, such as refugees, asylum seeker, and domestic violence survivor. And talking about relational ethics, I need about a year to get their trust to work with them. And important to note here that I have changed my mind when I'm working with them. So this is not only about getting the data, but also giving benefit to them. So it's not just about my research, but it's about how to support them, how to support their activities, how to support their families as well. So in doing this, actually, I have to understand how their way of life. And in doing so, I also brought my family in my research. So like I brought my husband, I brought my daughter to be involved in most of the community works. So I can reach the women, my husband can reach the men, and then my daughter can reach the kids. This is actually a very new approach for me, but then it gives me more wider perspective in understanding them. And yeah, so after a year, I think more than a year, then I started to really collect the data and then analyze how this community works and then getting their trusted relationship. And yeah, it not just give me the opportunity to get the wider perspective to understanding them, but also give me the opportunity to grow and connect it with their cycle, which is very excited for me. Thank you. Kia ora, Pita.
Kia ora, Nuke. Darrin. Kia ora, Darrin.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Darrin Hodgetts tuku ingoa no hokanui aku tūpuna. I'm Darrin Hodgetts. I'm a professor of societal psychology at Massey University, but probably my background is a community and health psychologist with an interest in precarious work, poverty, homelessness, and so on. And I've worked and published with most people on the panel, so it's kind of nice to be here with colleagues. It's also nice to get to go last. I bought Pita a beer, and it seems to have paid off for me. And then I get to see people like Mohi and Chris kind of sweat it a little bit at the beginning, which is always quite comforting. It makes me feel warm inside. I guess I could just reiterate around some of the comments that I think the relationship between qualitative inquiry, particular methods, and working in Indigenous communities is I really like the notion of inquiry rather than methodology or methods, because I always see, particularly with community research and engaging in different cultural milieu, you're almost like a detective, but you're a detective who's engaged in community participation, and you're working with people to try and find out about what's going on, if there are particular issues, but also the key other point, which I think Mohi was starting to allude to, which is in order to help and get involved. And I think this is a key difference, that the notion of going in and meddling in some of these settings and extracting information, or this thing we call data, so that we can own other people's accounts, is kind of a bit of a problematic practice that feels uncomfortable, feels a bit icky, and feels a bit exploitative. So I think that's why one of the reasons why this group in particular is becoming increasingly concerned around issues of relational ethics, which also speak to the points Mohi was making around sovereignty and self-determination. But also, how is it that qualitative researchers think that they can interview someone, extract their story, turn it into data, and then behave as if they own it? And this is something that increasingly isn't tolerated. I remember a conversation with Chris talking about how this is perceived in many Australian Aboriginal Torres Strait Island communities, which is similar to Aotearoa, where it's considered research robbery. And I think these are the things as a discipline that we need to start owning up to. I think we also need to start owning up to the fact that we need to build relationships with the communities we work with rather than do research on. And within that comes a methodological sophistication and realizing that what an interview means between two members of our settler society is very different to what it means between, say, a member of the settler society and a Māori person, or two Māori people. And I think an interview is not the same thing cross-culturally. And Jony's alluding to this in some of his comments around data, but also his comments around, we had a conversation early on in the supervision process about how he might indigenize his methods. And Jony read a lot of books, read a lot of methodological stuff, but still felt quite uncertain. And I remember Pita and I having a conversation with Jony and saying, well, how do you meet people? How do you greet people? And how do you build a relationship to talk with people? And then we got this lovely Javanese account about the levels of formality in the language and a process by which you would meet, and then they'd try and engage in very similar to how Māori operate. Where are you from? Who are your people? How do your people relate to the local community, and so on? And with that comes a whole set of accountabilities that are incredibly important, and not transgressing those accountabilities and relationships, because they are what make research possible, and they're really what make it accountable and ethical in that intergroup relational sense. So those are just some of the comments I wanted to make, and I'm also making them because we're situated within a school that's very hot on the so-called crisis in psychology. And I keep wondering, why is there a crisis in psychology when you don't believe in things like replication or a stable universe in the same way? And the reason I raise this in a qualitative context is I was horrified in the last couple of weeks to hear that some publications and journal houses are requiring people to lodge qualitative data the same way you would lodge statistical files as things that then can be exploited by other groups. From many Indigenous cultures, that's simply unethical behaviour, because it is not you, or it's not yours to give to anyone else as this free-floating thing that researchers have a tendency to translate human stories, accounts, experiences, some of which can be quite horrific, into a commodity that then gets incorporated into a neoliberal publishing system. So I do think as we advance as a discipline, and as we start taking indigeneity and different ways of understanding the world seriously, we need to realise that things like interviewing are not a method in the sense of a noun. They're a process of interviewing as a kind of verb. And what that means is when you engage in these processes in different cultural contexts, you need to understand the cultural milieu you're operating in. You need to do it in partnership with groups from that milieu if you're not from it yourself. You need to realise that the relational practices around respect and the use of information and guardianship of knowledge and so on need to be taken into consideration. And you also need to realise that Western or weird or Anglo-Saxon psychologies are not necessarily the psychologies in operation in terms of how people understand themselves and they understand their place in the world and relationship with other groups. So I know I've tried to kind of rush a bit of stuff in there and I've wandered around the three questions, but for me, these are kind of pressing concerns that require more thought and require more engagement, because central to our activities are issues of relational ethics, but those issues of relational ethics are forcing us to rethink what we actually mean by method, knowledge production, and sovereignty over that knowledge. Thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Darrin. And I think that was most of us. I think that's us. Kia ora. So yeah, I'd like to now segue into more sort of discussion and comments from the audience. So feel free to raise your hand or to just unmute. If there's someone who wants to go right now, jump, or we've got a comment in chat. The window is closing. Cool. I'll start with chat, but yeah. So comment from Christopher talks about how many of the things that we've talked about within this panel or this roundtable is about the importance of relationships. And the question is, have your efforts to establish such relationships in your projects ever created conflict with any institutions that sponsored, funded, oversaw your projects? And if so, how did you deal with these conflicts?
Did you want me to start that off?
Oh, no, this is open to anyone on the panel who's got an idea or an example that they care to share. So
I think just as a quick response, what I would say is those issues and those politics around funding can put you in a vulnerable situation, and they can lead to you being sometimes a little less forthcoming in terms of what the formal proposal says and what the actual practice in the field with groups actually manifests as. And sometimes you almost have to play a double game, because from our group's perspective, we're accountable primarily to the community before we're accountable to the funder. And I have seen people give funding back if the funder decides to get a bit too deterministic. But I'll hand it over to you, Danilo.
Oh, just a short comment on that question. I think that when we try to relativize or the rigidity of the mainstream researchers, I think it's important to say what we put in place of if we are going to avoid the methodologies, what we do, and then I think we need to have a rigid, maybe rigid, ethical concern in our researches, you know, so it's not only being flexible in the sense of relating with the others in a different way, but we have, I think I heard from all of you here is that we are always concerned with the relational ethics, and this concern implies to be involved in the main issues of the community we are working together. So we need to show to the mainstream psychology or to the reviewers when we are going to publish that we have some basic grounds that is important in the construction of knowledge. So it's not the same as, it's not only an epistemological concern, but it's based on the relational ethics that implies to think about the consequences of this knowledge for the community who are involved.
Kia ora, Danilo. Mohi, kia ora.
Just to quickly add to what Danilo and Darrin have said, and it actually points back to a few things that people have raised already relative to this question. And I just want to speak to ownership of research materials. And so one of the things that that's important methodologically for us to consider is ownership over research materials or knowledge or data or interview material. And so from my perspective, those who are giving us this material are the guardians of their own knowledge. And it's really important that we negotiate with them in a sort of a mutually acceptable form, the way we can protect their knowledge and disseminate that knowledge or that comes from our participants in a way that's relevant and specific to their needs. And there's a bit of tension around that in the institutions about knowledge ownership and knowledge use. And for far too long within the system in New Zealand, many academics have thrived, flourished, their careers have moved forward rapidly as a direct result of their owning the knowledge from their participants with little return to those participants. So from a kaupapa Māori perspective, or from a traditional Māori perspective, when it comes to research, it's important that we recognise guardianship over knowledge, and that knowledge still remains with the participants in this way. So I just want to leave that there, and others might want to comment on it or provide their own perspective on these sorts of things, but that's one thing that we have to deal with. I mean, there are many things from an Indigenous perspective, but that's just one of them.
Yeah, kia ora Mohi. It reminds me of, I was at a conference, I can't remember if it was an Indigenous conference or a community conference, and one of the keynotes was talking about research with their Indigenous community. And during the, when you give them information, all that sort of stuff, all of your accounts will be anonymized. And the participant ended up saying, well, this is my knowledge I'm giving you. Why do you get to take credit for what I'm saying? Why can't you publish my name? And they really did want to publish the name, so particular people can claim these contributions to the field. But depending on what university you're at, depending what the ethics panels are like, and the rules and regulations, the procedures, sometimes it is very difficult to honour Indigenous knowledge when you try to interface these relational ethics with procedural ethics of the institution.
Yeah, I mean, can I just respond to that or leverage off of that? The thing is, in terms of what you just mentioned, Pita, if we think about our work responding to the needs and aspirations of the groups we're working with, if I'm thinking about Māori in New Zealand, that positions us quite differently to notions of extraction, traditional notions of extraction that Darrin spoke to earlier. So a kaupapa Māori perspective would say that our research has to be done with our communities, for the benefit of our communities, often led by our communities as well. And I think that positions us quite different, uniquely or differently, and we have different conversations in knowledge production as a result. So I just wanted to put that in there.
Kia ora. So anyone from the audience care to comment, say anything, ask a question? Feel free, don't be shy.
I think it's wonderful what you're doing. And I'm still student-minded, just with an MA so far. But what I can see is this has been a problem in clinical psychology for years. And so all the more so at the community level. I guess my concern with providing names, even though the community wants it, would be, how do you protect them from exploitation or harm? Being that disclosive at a mass commercial maybe way. Yet at the same time, I like how at least your group, I don't know how many community psychs are as heartfelt in their ethics as you all are, but you, but I see where it's very important to give ownership to the communities and that they actually see some kind of return. And I think the only way to get that, and I'd like to see that at the clinical level as well. I think the only way to give that is to hear how they define being receivers of what you, your end result or your conclusions. They have to tell us how what they want to see from this, instead of us, you know, this is the result and this will help change your situation in time. You know, what do you want from it now? And I think it's important for them to think about what is it that they really want by disclosing their names, and know the risks, as many as we can come up with anyway, because they're so variable. And that's all. I just wanted to thank you so much. It's very heartwarming and inspiring to hear, especially that you are very committed to accountability and to the community over funding. I thought that was really significant. So thank you. I'm leaving for the night. I hope I see you all. I hope I see you all tomorrow in the United States when they present. Thank you.
Can I just, I don't know, Chris, I don't know if you were just going to jump in.
Oh, sorry, Mohi.
Go for it, Chris.
I'm just so slow. I think that question, the other question that Christopher asked, I think is an important one, because there's I mean, I would flip the question the other way in terms of the source of the conflict and the need to understand the agencies, the funders and so forth, because I mean, they're not always pure and so forth. So part of the responsibility that we also have as researchers is to also ask questions of those very funders and the sources of conflict there. So the project, and if we think about decoloniality as a project of humanizing, then we would also have to think back into these systems, because this is where a lot of the sources of the problems also start, because systems govern, and part of our work is to also understand and think through the governmentality of these very systems. And then so there's a dual task, I guess, in some sorts of ways too, which is this notion of developing the praxis and praxis as ongoing. And I think here we've spoken a lot about community engaged praxis and it as an evolving iterative sort of set of processes, practices. And I think Danilo spoke about how they are creating that contact zones between university, community, and so forth. And a lot of the work that we do, I think, sits at that very mobile sort of space. And I guess the stuff that everyone has spoken about here too is just the importance of the cultural worlds that we've inhabited, the ones that have been erased or made invisible and so forth, but the importance of that for futurity, yeah. And then for us to think about, well, what is the point of qualitative research in decolonial projects or indigenizing projects?
Can I butt in? Sorry for everybody. I had my hand raised. We have, I think, 30 seconds left. This was a fantastic opening for the day, and I think also for next day when we go back to the United States. So thank you so much. And I